Hello and welcome back to the Real Talk with Rhi podcast. I am Rhi from mummy4.com, and today I am going to share with you, I guess, not necessarily where our autism journey as a family began, because I think it began a long time before we realised it began, but at the beginning of where I was beginning to become aware of it up to the point where our first child was diagnosed. It's quite a story, so buckle up and hopefully this will give you a bit of an insight into our journey. And perhaps if you're going through something similar, the hope is it'll make you feel a little less alone, because I think that this whole process, when you start to become aware that there may be an issue, there may be struggles, there may be neurodiversity, and you don't know much about it, it's the first time you've really encountered it on a personal level, it can be quite emotional, it can be quite challenging, you don't really know which direction to go in with it. So fingers crossed, through this story you may feel a little bit less alone, a little bit more like a lot of other people are going through this, because honestly so many people are going through this, but not very many people talk about it. So with that said, so William is our second baby. We have 2 boys and 2 girls, all of which at this point in time have been diagnosed with autism, but they were not diagnosed in order. So I, just to take it way back, I grew up with sisters. So when I then had boys, we had Dylan, we got William, and they did things that I didn't really understand. My general take initially was, wow, I love my children, I love my boys so much, but I don't understand them. Men are clearly from Mars and women are clearly from Venus. They did stuff I just didn't get and couldn't explain. And I very much put it down to gender differences. It's like, wow, maybe if I'd had brothers, I would have understood this stuff, but I had sisters. So therefore I was like, wow, okay. I just thought it was eye-opening, and that gender differences in children were a natural thing, which I would still argue from my personal experience that my boys were quite different from my girls, but then everyone's individual. So how much of it's gender, how much of it's whatever. But that's largely what I put it down to as, let's just say, a very young, a young mum, a new mum. And the differences in the things and the behaviours then that I was noticing in William were quite different to the behaviours that I noticed in our eldest. So our eldest was very chatty from a very young age. Will, however, was very intelligent and still is incredibly intelligent. I don't know what his actual IQ is, but I know it's very high. But didn't show the same interest in being chatty. So as a very young baby, he was he thrived on routine. We had a slight issue where he was struggling to breastfeed, and he'd only feed, I'm just thinking about this now actually, I'm wondering if this is relevant. He would only feed one, I can't remember which way round it was. Just in this very moment is it occurring to me that this might have been related to maybe autism? I don't know. But he went through this query failure to thrive thing. I was breastfeeding, but he only wanted to feed off one boob. So it was I'd have to feed him one direction. If you're listening in the podcast now, you can't see my arm gesturing to tell this story because I was not planning to tell it, but I just realised that it might be relevant. So he only wanted to feed one way. So in order to, if you've ever breastfed, you know that you have to switch them out. You have to feed one boob then the other boob, otherwise you get one very engorged painful boob, and then one will naturally learn to produce more and you just end up with really wonky lopsided painful boobs, which is not very fun. So to try and get him to feed off both boobs, I had to trick him and it's called a rugby hold, where you rather than feed the baby naturally as you would, or head on the boob and feet on the other side, you have to feed them tuck them under your arm. So I had to do all this stuff, and then I was expressing and chopping up and whatever. And then, as long story short, by the time we got to see a consultant, he was what can only be described as a lovely chunky baby. He had reserves, which is kind of what you want in a baby a little bit, don't you? You want them to, if they are unwell, I think as a mum it feels quite comforting, or did for me anyway, that if they had a little bit of extra weight when they were really tiny, in that kind of pre-walking kind of stage. Anyway, there's that issue resolved. But other than that, there were no like major issues with him when he was small. He was a very good eater initially. Did baby-led weaning, which my husband used to just call throwing food on the floor. And initially, I had the baby-led weaning cookbook, and he ate all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. I'm talking cheese and spinach savoury muffins and things. Just stuff that I wouldn't even consider making or feeding to the children now. But all this stuff, he just ate everything. And then I think the eating is probably the most significant, or one of the most significant things that we noticed quite early on, in that his diet became more and more restrictive. So I wasn't offering him, quote unquote, a junk food because he was still quite little, but he was eating less and less variety then. So the stuff he was eating was all good stuff. It was quite nutritionally balanced. He was sort of getting everything he needed from it, but it ended up being literally the same thing every single day. So he would have cereal, the exact same cereal, and strawberries for breakfast every single day. Then he would have, let me get this right now, banana and cream cheese sandwiches and something else for lunch. But basically fruit, cream cheese sandwiches. So it had some like extra dairy in there because when I stopped breastfeeding him, he would not drink milk. So I was like, right, must squeeze cheese into his diet, like yogurt and things, around his diet because he just would not drink milk. And then for dinner, he would eat, and this is probably the most difficult one because everything else is a bit more portable. You can take sandwiches and fruit with you, can't you? But he would only eat this one pasta dish. I used to buy the multicoloured pasta. I don't know if it actually does have more nutritional value, but I figured it had I think it was like spinach in the green and tomato in the red. So it would have this multicoloured pasta, and I would make like a vegetably, I guess it's like a ratatouille type thing, sauce with chicken in it, and I would blend it into the sauce. So there's all this goodness in the sauce and you couldn't see what it was. So blending it in made it not a terribly attractive colour. It was like a reddy brown colour, but he ate it. He lapped it up every day. It was an easy way to get all the goodness into him, and he would eat it every day, but to the point where he would only eat that exact dish. So we couldn't go to a restaurant and buy him pasta because it wouldn't look the same. I couldn't even feed him plain pasta. I couldn't even say in a restaurant, can you just bring me plain pasta? Because it wouldn't be the exact same. If it wasn't the exact same, he wouldn't eat it. So the only way we could eat out is to speak to the restaurant and say, we've got an incredibly fussy child. Will you heat up this meal for us? Because that's all he'll eat. And in all fairness, people were very accommodating. And bear in mind, this was before I knew it was autism. So I couldn't say my child has autism and therefore this is what, this is why I'm asking you to do this. Which with hindsight, that would have been very helpful to be able to say, it's not just him being fussy. It's not just me being fussy. This is a challenge here. So all of this was before we knew, but this was quite a big challenge. I'm going to admit right now, it was something challenging because it's a bit awkward, when you're going somewhere and you're buying meals. I mean, we bought meals for everyone else, but wouldn't buy a meal for him. We'd have to ask them to heat things up. And when we went places regularly, then they were accommodating, but it was awkward. But I think my biggest challenge was, if you go for a full day out, I'd have to make sure I took enough food for him because there wasn't anything I could just buy. And it just got to a stage where I just wish he'd eat just slightly less healthy food in addition to his healthy food that I could buy out. Like, I was just desperate for him to eat just chips because if we're somewhere, you can always buy a side order of chips. And as challenging as it is when you've got a plain eater that you're worried about not being able to eat nutritionally balanced meals, that's challenging. But you can get the kind of things that most plain eaters will eat most places. I mean, we went on a touring holiday, a caravan. Years ago, we used to have a touring caravan. We towed it over to, I say we, my husband did, I didn't used to tow it. But we packed it up and he drove it, we all went over to France. And I actually had to take enough of these meals with me, knowing that if we got there and we ran out of food for him, he just wouldn't eat. And it was a challenge. It was a real challenge. So it wasn't until he started school that this went from, yes, this is challenging, to some level of awareness. I couldn't actually tell you the moment or the thing I read or the video I saw where I thought, oh, we could be dealing with autism here. I genuinely can't remember. I don't think there was a light bulb moment. All I do know is before having children, my understanding of what autism was not very accurate and is not how I understand it to be now. So I only knew of one person when I was in school that had been diagnosed with autism, and this particular person had one-to-one care around the clock, was totally non-verbal, and eventually went on to live at a residential place that looks after people with autism that can't manage by themselves. So that's what I thought autism was, because, I mean, let's face it, I'm born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s. There wasn't much information about this sort of stuff. And now with hindsight, with all I know, I can think of a lot of people I went to school with that probably had autism, a lot. And it just wasn't, I'm assuming they weren't diagnosed. If they were, no one talked about it, like nobody. There were some people I knew that were diagnosed with dyslexia, but I think that was pretty much it. I don't remember anyone that I knew of being diagnosed with autism or ADHD. It just wasn't, I guess there wasn't the awareness, and therefore there wasn't the support. So going into having children, I didn't understand what autism was. I wasn't on the lookout for the signs. And quite frankly, the 2-year checks don't seem to be geared up. In fact, I'm not even sure they're called 2-year checks. They used to be called 2-year checks. But the health visitor used to come out and do these checks for autism, and well, screening for lots of things, but some of the things they're screening for autism. And I know that they are not really designed well enough to pick up children with high functioning autism. They're more designed to pick up children with learning difficulties, yes, but my children all kind of slipped through the net when it came to those assessments. So let's talk very briefly about that 2-year check as it used to be known. I know I've got a number of friends who are health visitors, and I know that the system has been restructured slightly now, where you get checked on a little bit earlier and then a little bit later than 2 years, but there are similar checks still going on when you meet with your health visitor. But my health visitor I had a very good relationship with, because I'd been talking to her extensively through his Query Failure to Thrive episode. Knew he was incredibly advanced. I don't think she even took off her coat during the 2-year check. It was like, I've got no concerns here. He stood up and recited the alphabet and then did some other very advanced things. He really loved flashcards and could identify all the letters. He was reading very, very young. He could read by 3. But even at this 2-year check, he was doing things that were incredibly advanced for his age. So she was just like, very much, well, I have no concerns here. Ultimately, what I know now is that if development is what's known as spiky, as in incredibly advanced in some areas and yet not matching that level in other areas, that in itself can be, perhaps a red flag is the wrong term, but an indicator of autism. By the way, I have put together a document, a PDF download that I just wish someone had given to me, because as you will learn as we carry on through this episode, there were terribly challenging meetings and appointments I had to go to during the assessment for Will, and I just felt so unprepared and like I didn't know what I was going to be asked. And then they asked me, have you noticed him doing this? Have you noticed him doing that? And I was like, oh, I don't know, because I've not been looking out for it. And I just felt like a really terrible mum, which I know I am aware that I was probably being a bit hard on myself, but it was not a good feeling. And I like to go into things feeling like I'm doing the best for my children, feeling like I'm prepared. And if someone had handed me this and said, look, read through this, have a look for all these different things, mark down what you notice, what you don't notice, I would have gone into these meetings feeling prepared. So I've put together this PDF. It's 100 signs of autism, 100 signs that could indicate autism. I should actually, mention, as with when I share anything online, I'm not a doctor. I'm just sharing my experiences with my own family, my quite extensive experience, but I'm not a doctor. And even if I was a doctor, I'm not your doctor. This is sort of general information. So if you have any concerns, please do speak to your own health practitioner. It's always worth remembering that. Anyway, you can download this PDF if you go to mummyoffour.com/100ASD. pop your email address in and I'll send it to you. And hopefully that will be super helpful. I know the people that have been using it so far have been finding it helpful. And it's not a diagnostic tool, but it is definitely a tool to open up conversations and to be like, oh, do you know what? I'd never even realised that was a thing that was associated with autism. Yes, they do that. Or, oh, I'm going to keep an eye out for that one. Or actually, no, they don't do this at all. So yeah, hopefully that will be as helpful to you as it's been to lots of other people. So anyway, in this 2-year check, the health visitor came back with 0 concerns, clearly a very bright child. With hindsight, if I'd perhaps brought up some of these other things that I now know are indicators of autism, then we would have got the ball rolling a lot younger and had that understanding and support sooner. I mean, ultimately, this is still a story of early intervention, partly due to a little bit of pushing on my part, because once I realised an assessment was necessary, I kind of became laser focused on making sure that was what happened, but we'll get to that. So when Will started school, they had a meeting, like a little induction day, and his teacher, who I've since become friends with because she's amazing, but I didn't actually know her at the time, so I was just introducing Will to the classroom, and I said to her, look, he's really bright, he can already read. She's like, they're 3, we don't do reading yet. Well, he can read, but you're not going to be able to get him to keep his shoes on indoors. One of his massive things was if we were indoors, he took off his shoes. Because at home we took off our shoes indoors. I mean, we still do. It's just to avoid having to do as much cleaning. We leave our shoes, near the front door in storage or whatever. But because this was a rule that we take our shoes off indoors, wherever we were indoors, he took off his shoes. If we're in the car, shoes off. If we were in a cafe, shoes off. And just nip into the post office, shoes off, which is quite challenging. So he did spend a lot of time in the pram because he was an incredibly busy toddler. And it didn't matter if he kicked off his shoes inside the footpath of the pram then, going in and out of shops. So I said to her, look, he's very bright. He can already read. You're not going to be able to get him to keep his shoes on or sit down and join in. I said, I'm pretty sure, I was very flippant, I'm pretty sure we're dealing with he's somewhere on the spectrum. But I kind of left it at that. I left this. It was a very flippant remark. It was something I kind of understood on a subconscious level. So by the time he was starting school, I acknowledged to myself he was probably somewhere on the spectrum, but I was not yet at the stage where I understood that something needed to be done about that, probably because I didn't know enough about it. I was incredibly nervous about him starting school because I knew that he was quite a happy child, but largely because I put things in place. So he was happy as long as he had the exact same meals. He was happy as long as he had me to sort of translate what he wanted. He could speak because he could read, and he would read aloud, but he didn't really want to talk to many people. It was almost like people irritated him, and he'd talk to me with minimal words. He would use as few words as possible, but he'd communicate his needs with me. And I always understood his needs and met them. And as long as I did that, he was happy. But there wasn't really anyone else that could keep him happy. As it was a very sort of rigid routine that had evolved. I don't even remember how, but at one stage he wouldn't eat anything unless I counted to 20 first. I don't remember how it came about, but there was a stage that my best friend reminded me of recently where we'd be in, I don't know, like a cafe after a baby group and after a toddler group, and I'd be feeding him and I'd have to count to 20, give him his food, and then he'd be fine. And I don't remember where it came from, but it was one of these little phases that he would not eat unless I did that. So someone else, if I'd given him to someone else to look after, they wouldn't have known, and then he would have been really unhappy and he wouldn't have eaten. I would like to add that phase did not last forever, and obviously he will now eat and has done for many years without me counting to 20. So this too shall pass is probably a phase as all us parents should keep in the forefront of our minds, because most phases are just that. Not to say that they're not replaced with new phases and new challenges, but things do pass. So anyway, he started school, and then his teacher called me in and said, when you said you thought that he might have autism, I think you're probably right. So this was the case where we live at the time. Now, obviously, this was some time ago, and I think it depends county by county, certainly England versus Wales, or hospital trust by hospital trust. But at the time, children under 5 were dealt with by the NHS. You'd go through the health visitor. And at the time, the children who were over age 5, so even though Will was in school, he was in what's called Rising Threes nursery, which is generally afternoon, but not always afternoon nursery, the school year in which they turn 3 and they start after their 3rd birthday. So he started the term after his 3rd birthday. And then morning nursery, which is generally called, it could be in the afternoons, but the normal nursery year in Wales, I think it's in most of Wales, is the school year in which they turn 4. So he spent a year plus a term in that kind of nursery setting before he went into full-time school and reception. And any children at the time pre-age 5, and I'll get to when in other episodes I share my other children's stories, that was not quite as cut and dry for some of my other children, but at the time, and children under 5 were dealt with by the health visitor, and that system, in comparison to the school system, was quick and reasonably slick. And at the time, the children over age 5 were dealt with by the sort of educational psychologist and just went through a different system. So it was the school education system, which was really overburdened and very, very slow. So she said, look, get in touch with your health visitor and see if you can get a referral through there, because it'll be so much quicker than putting him on the school list. And he was of an age where that was possible. So I went through probably 48 hours of denial at this stage. So even though the initial, he's probably someone on the spectrum, came from me, when I was faced with it as potentially being the truth, I did my own, let's call it research, and I had decided that he didn't have autism, he was gifted or more able and talented, and that sometimes children who are gifted or more able and talented can exhibit symptoms. I found some evidence to back this up, that some of those children can appear to have symptoms similar to autism, but actually just be more able and talented. So I don't know where I found this, but let's just call it confirmation bias. I think that's what I was looking for, evidence to support what I wanted to believe at the time. And then I called the health visitor for urgent meeting, and I met up with her and I said to her, the school think it's autism, but it's this, isn't it? And she was like, yeah, that sounds very convincing and very plausible. So I went back to the school and I said, I spoke to my health visitor and she agrees he's not got autism, he's just more able and talented, he's gifted. Which, I mean, he probably is as well, to be fair. He is incredibly bright. And she looked at me and she went, no, you were right the first time. We're going to need to get him assessed. And I went, oh, and I kind of, the penny dropped of what I'd been doing, and it was just kind of denial. So from that point of view, I went into mega organized mode. I was researching and learning as much as I could. I managed to get him on the referral list. I spoke to the secretary of the consultant who was due to assess him, and I would phone her reasonably regularly and say, hi, it's just me again, really sorry to bother you, I'm just wondering where he is on the list. Obviously I'm very concerned, because I was. And I wasn't kind of nagging from a moaning, whinging kind of place, because I don't think anyone needs that, and I don't think it ever gets you anywhere. But I was just being very honest in that I was very concerned. I was genuinely sorry to bother her, and I really, really was concerned about him, and I was worried that if I didn't get the support for him, that he was going to struggle in school. And this was my kind of big concern. As soon as I realised that it probably was actually autism we were dealing with, I just had this big fear that I think that he wouldn't be understood in school, and his behaviour would be misinterpreted as quote unquote naughty, because he didn't want to join in, he didn't want to do certain things. And I didn't want him to, as he went further through the school, just be labelled as naughty or difficult. When he wasn't naughty or difficult, he was challenging in some ways because he required extra things in place to feel happy. But I was really, really worried that not getting him the help and the understanding, more to the point, not getting the assessment, would mean that people wouldn't understand him and they would misinterpret his behaviour, and therefore he would struggle in school. And I just didn't want that for him. So eventually then the consultant, who was lovely, phoned me back. The secretary must have been like, look, this woman keeps phoning me, she's very worried, can you just ring? So she phoned me and she was so lovely. She kind of did a very basic, not an assessment on the phone, but asked me for what's going on. And she said, it appears to be it looks like we probably are dealing with autism here. He's going to need an assessment, and, the next steps will be whatever. And at that point, I do remember asking her, I said, look, while I've got you on the phone, thank you so much for, putting me on the list for the assessment. While I've got you on the phone, what do I do about his eating? Because he's so rigid. Do I just kind of go, because I had a lot of people going, well, just put different food in front of him and be like, well, eat it, don't eat it, whatever, if you're hungry, you'll eat. And she said, well, if he was neurotypical, which just means doesn't have autism, that would work, because a child who is otherwise healthy, mentally and physically, will not starve themselves. However, a child with autism might starve themselves, so don't do that. So that kind of gave me permission, I suppose, to ignore those people in my life that were telling me to do those things that I knew weren't going to work. I knew in my gut, but it gave me that, no, I've been told I mustn't do this. Like, you can stop now. You can stop nagging me to do this. Because there were people in my life that were quite negative and did believe that I was causing some of the behaviour that he was exhibiting. And I was very much being blamed for it. We then went through the assessment process, which consisted of some meetings where there were kind of preliminary things that we discussed, which I will share a few of those now with you. And then there was a joint communication clinic and ADOS. Now, I'm not going to go into all of that in depth today in this episode, but I will speak about that in future episodes. So make sure you are subscribed to both the YouTube channel with bell notifications on or to the podcast channel if you're listening, because coming up for you, I will talk about in depth more so what goes on in that ADOS assessment. So some of the things that when I was discussing with the consultant, turned out were indicators of autism. So the food one, obviously the narrowing of the meals. Lack of use of eye contact and gesture were things like, if you notice, like I talk, you can't see if you're listening, but I talk with my hands a lot. My children don't tend to do that. They don't move their hands when they're speaking the way that I do. So that can be an indicator of autism. Again, they'd say things like, does he point at things? Or does he bring things to show you? And I'd be like, oh, I don't know, flustered. I haven't been looking out for that, which is why I put together that document for you. So make sure you just go to the link in the description, pop your email address in, and I'll send you that document so you can go through it, familiarise yourself with the sort of things you can be looking out for, and then go through and, tick off which things you do and don't notice, and you can feel a bit more prepared than I felt going to these meetings. So another example of something that turned out was a sign of autism was he had this massive thing about shoes. So if you live in the UK and you've ever shopped in a Clark shop for your small children, you might know what doodles are, which they're kind of sandals for small children. They're kind of canvas sandals with like a rubber sole and like a clasp buckle. They generally have a little picture or pattern on the front. They're like cutesy baby shoes. Very much sort of quite summery shoes. But these are the only shoes he would wear. We would have such meltdowns in the shoe shops to the point where I'd be like, can you just bring me a larger pair of doodles, please? And we'll put them on his feet and he'll hopefully won't notice they're not the same ones. He would not wear any other shoes. He would not wear wellies, nothing. Just this exact same pair of doodles in a large size over and over and over again. I was worried what we were going to do when he eventually grew out of the doodle sizes. Luckily, we put lots of things in place and, excuse me, that's my stomach rumbling because I'm hungry. Luckily, we put lots of things in place and suffice to say, he no longer has to wear doodles. There was a very specific incident, which was like a sensory thing, I suppose, where he was really uncomfortable with this present he'd been given because it had come out of wrapping paper. And shortly after this, we realised he had a massive phobia of wrapping paper. But this particular item, it was a Thomas the Tank Engine train, and he loved these. But because he'd taken it out of this wrapping paper, it's like he wouldn't touch it, like that had been poisoned or contaminated. And then there was a whole phase of quite some time where we couldn't wrap any of his presents, because if it had been near wrapping paper, then he wouldn't go anywhere near it. It was like it had been poisoned. This did not last forever, but it did last, I want to say probably a 9 month to a year period where wrapping paper was the devil. And I'm guessing that was a sensory thing, not liking the, I don't know, noise, feel of it, something like that. But that was, a good example of something we talked about in the assessment, or certainly in the preliminary meetings where we talked about the sorts of challenges he had. Haircuts. There's a picture of him having his hair cut. He's literally upside down with 3 people holding him still. 3 people. Haircuts were a nightmare. We've talked about the shoe thing, taking off the shoes indoors. And he just sort of wasn't interested in joining in. You know, I used to take him to all sorts of baby groups and things. He just wanted to do his own thing. He was not interested in doing what other people wanted him to do. He liked routine. He liked to sit in the same spot. He liked formats to follow the same thing. But he did not like doing things that other neurotypical children wanted to do. He just wasn't for him. He did do a lot of lining things up. There were a lot of lining up the trains and a lot of making patterns and things out of them, and more lining up than actual playing. But yeah, a lot of these things we discussed in these initial meetings, and then they went on and did this ADOS assessment with him where I watched through one-way glass, and they did a series of things that sort of looked like games. They would bring things out and show him things, and then they'd watch for certain responses. It'd be like, it was like a Lightning McQueen toy, I remember, and they lifted it up and they were looking for his reaction, and they were looking, showing him pictures in books and asking him what he did and didn't notice. And they were looking for his reactions in certain things. They were looking for his use of eye contact, use of gesture, and how that would compare to other children his age who were neurotypical, and then that's marked across the board. So that's a very, very brief description of the ADOS, but like I said, I will go through that in future episodes. There are also videos on my main Mummy of 4 UK channel, vlogs I filmed at the time, like the day after my girls' ADOS assessments, where I kind of give a very in-depth descriptions of what was going on in them. So he had the social communication clinic, he had the ADOS. I watched that ADOS through the one-way glass, and one thing I really noticed is how much I wanted to jump in and help him. Normally people would say to him, I think, you know, like, William, what do you think of this, or look at this, and I would almost translate things for him or give him that extra encouragement to join in or to facilitate conversations, I suppose. And watching through this one-way glass, I just could see what they were expecting from him in a reaction and that he wasn't giving those reactions. And it was quite hard to watch, because I wouldn't say it was like watching, it wasn't watching him fall on his face, because that's not fair or accurate really, but it was watching and understanding they were expecting certain reactions and not getting them. And it just became so evident to me in those moments as I was watching him, how much I helped him and how much extra help and intervention we were going to need for when I'm not around, when he's in school or whatever, in order to help him integrate. So after the assessment, they don't actually give you the results on the day. There's lots of adding up. It's quite in depth, and then they bring you back and they give you the details of the results on a separate day. Circling back slightly, because I think this is worth mentioning, the Joint Social Communication Clinic and the ADOS, they kind of squeezed him in. They had spots and they said, look, it's quite last minute, and normally we do these a few weeks apart, but it was like they were consecutive days, and it was like something like one of them was in the morning on day 1 and then the other one was in the afternoon on day 2, something like that. But it was also his school concert, so it was like the assessment was in the morning, then he had a concert in the afternoon, and then it was a concert in the morning, assessment in the afternoon. And I would like to mention and have it known that he did not find the assessment stressful at all. The people were lovely. We basically went in, he played with toys. They were watching how he was playing with toys in a structured way, but they were observing how he was playing with toys. And it was not stressful at all for him. It was not invasive. It was not intrusive. It was not horrible in any way. I must have been incredibly stressed. I think I'd put myself under a lot of pressure to try and make sure I got this assessment done. I was very, very worried. I felt like I was under a lot of pressure from people in my life who at the time were less so in my life, but I'd faced a lot of criticism over what I'd caused and what I was doing, how I was parenting him. And ultimately, I think I was worried that he did have autism and they wouldn't see enough autism to diagnose him with autism, and then he wouldn't get the help he needed, even though he really needed it. I think that was my biggest fear. And then I was going back and forth in my head between, is this autism? Is it all in my head? is it how I've parented? All these thoughts. So there were these 2 days, and for me, even though they were not stressful for him, I was clearly quite stressed because I came out in this rash all over my face, and I can only describe it as it looked like I'd contoured my face with acid, because it was like sunburn and it was very sore, kind of all along my cheekbones, all along my eye socket, just red raw, peeling skin. And I think it was just stress. I think I was incredibly stressed. I think I put myself under a lot of pressure, and I literally just came out in a rash all over my face from stress. That's the only thing that I can explain it with. So it was a couple of stressful days, and then I want to say a couple of weeks-ish, and then we were called back in for the results, which were that, yes, he did have autism. It was not in my head. And although initially I felt, similar with all of them actually, kind of numb and like I just didn't want to speak to anyone. I'm just talking for like an hour or so after the actual assessment, kind of in shock, relieved that if he did have autism, which he did, that it was picked up, so I'd be able to get him that help. And I think there's this element of, I'm going to use the word grief, but explain that, in that I now understand that autism is not a bad thing. It's just a list of someone's particular struggles. Everyone struggles with something. This is how I explain it to my children. Everyone struggles with something. It's just not everyone's struggles have a name. So if you are incredibly shy, but just that's it, you're just incredibly shy, there's no actual help with that. Or if you're just not amazing at reading, you just find it a bit difficult, you're not dyslexic or anything, you've not got a label, then there's no real extra help or support for that. I mean, hopefully the teacher will help and support your child if they're struggling with reading, but there's no label for that. Or if you just find maths hard, if you don't have an actual diagnosis of anything, you just find something difficult. I guess what I'm trying to say is at some point in our lives, we're all going to struggle with some things. And we don't have crystal balls to know what our children are going to struggle with as they grow. However, when your child gets a diagnosis of something, you're being told they're going to struggle with this, this, and this. And I think what we forget in those moments is they're always going to have struggled with something. We just are not normally given a list of what those struggles are going to be. Sadly, our kids are going to find challenges in their lives, and hopefully we'll be able to support them through them. But ultimately, if we know what those challenges are, we are therefore able to support them. And if we don't know what the challenges are, then how can we give them our support in a really effective way? So the grief was like knowing that he was going to struggle with certain things. That's what the grief was. And the worry that came with that. But ultimately what I've come to realize is having a diagnosis, if your child needs one, obviously if your child doesn't need one, they don't need a diagnosis. But if you have a diagnosis of something for your child, it just means you've got a list of ways that they're going to struggle, and therefore a list of ways you can be able to help and support them. Just because they have never been diagnosed with anything doesn't mean they're not going to struggle with stuff. You just don't know what the struggles are going to be yet. And you may be a little more blindsided when it comes around. So yes, I did go through a reasonably short phase actually of feeling grief, I suppose. There was also a lot of relief, but also a lot of like, I guess it's like, have you ever been ill on the first day of your annual leave? Like, you've worked so hard to get everything finished to leave for work, and then you've worked, and then you just get really ill on the first day of your holiday. It's like when you finally stop, your body goes, ugh, and just you lets go of like that fight, having to keep going, and you feel a bit rubbish. I think it was a little bit like that. It's like the fight was over, the danger had passed. Not that there was any danger, but my fight or flight response, I didn't have to keep pushing. And that in itself is something that you'll only really understood if you've experienced it. Shout out to all the autism parents that have ever experienced that. Now, obviously, I can go into in future episodes, and I absolutely will, about more detail about the ADOS assessment and support that he received after the assessment, because there was quite a lot. But I think what I'd like to skip ahead to is that William, at the time of filming this, is 12 and such an amazing human being. He is bright, happy. He is just a content child. He is loving school. He has great friends who are kind of similar kind of characters to him. He has interests that he's so passionate about. And I think the biggest thing that I would probably note is that in comparison to how he was as a toddler, which was incredibly challenging, and I was worried that if I ever left him with anyone other than me, he just wouldn't cope. He just actually takes life in his stride the easiest out of the four. He is what I would call a poster child for early intervention. It's not to say that he never struggles with anything, because that wouldn't be accurate or fair, because obviously there are still struggles, but compared to that little toddler, if someone could go back to me when he was not yet assessed, and I was so worried, if someone could go back in time and tell me or show me how he is now, the sigh of relief I would have breathed, honestly. So I think the moral of the story, and what I'd like you to take away from this, is if you have ever thought, oh, I wonder if there is something going on here, or ever had to Google, does my child have autism, or you ever want to message someone and say, should I get them assessed? My answer to you is going to be, if you've got those concerns, speak to a professional, speak to your GP, speak to your school, get the wheels in motion, get them on the list. The lists are incredibly long at the moment, sadly, but get them on the list. And then at the time when the assessment comes around, you'll either be going, well, that turned out to be something and nothing, it's fine, give the spot to someone else, or wow, I'm so glad I put their name down when I did, because the challenges have got more. Because I don't personally believe, having witnessed the entire assessment process and how in depth it is, I don't ever believe that someone would come out with a diagnosis that they don't need, which I know is a concern of lots and lots of parents. However, I know of so many children who have not been flagged for assessment, or it's been flagged too late to really feel the benefits of school and things, and children that were like, no, they don't need to be assessed, don't get put forward, and actually end up that they do have autism. So if that would be my advice to you, if you have concerns, if you've got enough of a concern to Google it, enough of a concern to DM me and be like, Rhi, should I? My answer to you would be, if you're worried enough to ask, then yes, pursue it, because you're not going to regret looking into things and then being like, oh, turns out it was nothing. You might be thinking, oh, I wish I'd started this process sooner because they're struggling now. And that is what I would say to you, to younger me, certainly to younger me. And we'll talk about in a future episode the story with our eldest, which was less obvious, but ultimately more challenging for lots of different reasons. So that's the story for another day. Let me know if you want to hear that one. So thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of Real Talk with Rhi. Make sure you download that PDF I was talking about. The link's down in the description. Check out my Patreon for some early release videos and planners and all that kind of thing from me. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Mwah.